Thank you, Gus. We're really excited on behalf of the Salisbury Conservation Commission, you know, a little town in west central Vermont, to have somebody of your eminence speaking for us. And we're really excited that everybody here who has joined us has an interest in long-term sustainability and looking at larger systems and how we might need to be changing some of the larger systems that have been in place for a long time. I heard Gus speak at Middlebury. Gus, I don't remember, maybe 10 years ago at Middlebury College, maybe more.
Could have been.
And I was very impressed that Gus was comfortable speaking about things that even a lot of conservationists were hesitant to talk about, and some of the systemic changes that we really need to make if we hope to maintain healthy working ecosystems for our children and grandchildren. I hope you guys got a chance to read Gus's biography. I edited it and cut it about in half when I sent it out, and I'm not going to go over it all again today, but do take a look at it if you will. What I didn't mention in there is some of the more recent things. Gus now lives in Vermont and has an association with the Gund Institute at UVM and has recently taught at Vermont Law School. And you know, it would take me 15 minutes to go back through the rest of his CV. I'll let you guys read that later. As you join us, make sure that you are muted and you can stop the video on your end. If you have any issues, questions, you can get in touch with Kate Kelly, who you should be able to see on the top of your screen. She's taking care of any of the technical issues that might come up. I am essentially just the host. We will record this presentation. It's recording now, and we will make it available after the fact online, and I will send out a link to this site where we put it within the next few days. And let me see. At the end, we will have time for questions, but if you have a question during the presentation, just use the chat box. And if you move your cursor over the bottom of your screen, you should see where it says chat. And if you click on that, chat box will appear on the right. And you can type in a question there and then just hit return. I am hearing that my voice is a lot louder than Gus's. I don't know, Gus, maybe you just got to get closer to the screen or something. I'm not sure how we deal with that. I will back up. People won't be hearing me at all in a minute. So
I turned mine up. Is that better?
I can hear you fine. We'll see. So Gus is going to speak on the topic, is our current economic system the solution or the threat to a healthy planet? It's all yours, Gus.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank everyone for joining us tonight. And thanks to the Salisbury Conservation Commission. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to have these few words. I hope you're all warm, and this advance notice, you may hear a dog barking at some point. It's almost inevitable that something in the yard will stir folly up, and I apologize in advance. I want to speak with you about the political economic system in which we live and work every day. I want to examine that system, beginning with its performance, and do it from an environmental perspective. But the truth is that the conclusions here would emerge if one looked at it from a dozen major areas of national concern. I remember 50 years ago, my little daughter and I were on the mall in Washington for the first Earth Day. a group of us were at that time launching the Natural Resources Defense Council. And since then, NRDC and other US environmental groups have racked up more victories and accomplishments than one can count. And I shudder to think what our world would be like had they not. But I still think we've got now to face up to a deeply troubling paradox. Our environmental organizations have grown stronger, more sophisticated, better funded, but the environment has continued to go downhill. Not in every way, but in far too many ways. And not just slightly downhill. Here we are 50 years after that first Earth Day, and we're on the cusp of a ruined planet. The climate change is coming at us very hard, and the great climate tragedy is now unfolding. And around the world and here at home, we are losing biodiversity and forests and fisheries and agricultural soils at frightening rates. Freshwater shortages are multiplying, and toxics accumulate in ecosystems and in us. Here in the US, half of the freshwater bodies in our country still don't meet the goal of fishable and swimmable, which was set in the 1972 Clean Water Act and was supposed to be met by 1983. About half of Americans live with unhealthy levels of air pollutants at some time during the year. Since the early 80s, we've lost open space the size of Washington State. Urban and industrial sprawl, much of it into prime agricultural land. 30% of US plant species and about 18% of animal species are now threatened with extinction in the US. And our record on climate inaction, I think, has got to rank as the greatest dereliction of civic responsibility in the history of the Republic. There's an annual survey of country by country environmental performance done by Yale and Columbia for the World Economic Forum. And the index is built with end result numbers like emission measures. And it's not a level of effort thing about how hard countries are trying, but what they're doing. And in the 2020 report, the US ranked 24th overall, at the bottom of all the advanced economies. We ranked 25th in environmental health, 23rd in drinking water, 67th in biodiversity protection, 62nd in wetland loss, 122nd in fisheries management, and 15th on climate change. We're also at the bottom among advanced countries in our ecological footprint per capita. And you have to remember here, we're not competing against a group of stars. So something's terribly wrong. Clearly, more of the same that we've been doing for the past several decades, more of that same cannot be the answer. We've now had decades of more of the same, and we're in the midst of the very planetary conditions we set out in 1970 to prevent. Environmentalists truly believed that during those decades that the current system could be made to work. And laude, we worked hard at it. And many of you did, I'm sure, as well. But we've now run this half-century experiment testing whether it's true that the system can be made to work, only to find out that it isn't. So here's the most important thing I want to say to you this evening. System change is essential because our environmental problems and the climate emergency are deeply rooted in defining features of our current system, of this political economy that we live and work in. Our climate and environmental problems, and indeed much else, are products of the current system. And I want to go through with you some of the key features of our political economy, key features that I believe are at the root of the problem. An unquestioning society-wide commitment to economic growth at virtually any cost. A measure of that growth, GDP, that includes not only the good, but the bad and the ugly. powerful corporate interests whose overriding objectives is to generate profit and to grow, including reaping profit from avoiding the social and environmental costs that they create, the externalities. And markets that systematically fail to recognize these external costs unless corrected by government, but government that's subservient to corporate interest and the growth imperative. Rampant consumerism spurred endlessly on by sophisticated advertising, social injustice and economic insecurity so vast that they paralyze action and empower false claims that needed measures would cost jobs and ruin the economy. Dominant cultural values that are excessively materialistic and individualistic, anthropocentric, and economic activity now so large in scale that its impacts alter the planet's fundamental biophysical operations. Our country will never be able to go far enough or fast enough doing the right things on climate as long as our systemic priorities are ramping up GDP, growing corporate profits, increasing the incomes of the already well-to-do, neglecting the half of Americans that just get by, feeding runaway consumerism, focusing only on the present moment, facilitating great bastions of corporate power, and helping abroad only modestly or not at all. This complex is the citadel of power that we are up against. It is what has been destroying the environment and climate. And let history be our guide, it will continue to do so unless we change it, unless we change the system. We've got to drive deep change across a dozen fronts until the old failing system yields to a new system. It's clearly time for something different, a new environmentalism that seeks to change the system. So let's ask again the basic question. What's an environmental issue? Well, we say air pollution, water pollution, biodiversity loss, of course. But what if part of the answer is that environmental issues include anything that determines environmental outcomes, environmental results, the possibilities of success? Then surely creeping plutocracy and corporatocracy, the ascendancy of money power and corporate power over people power are environmental issues. And more, the chartering and empowering of artificial persons to do virtually anything in the name of profit and growth, the fetish of GDP growth as the ultimate public good and a main aim of government, runaway consumerism, vast social insecurity, with half of US families living paycheck to paycheck. These are certainly among the underlying drivers of environmental outcomes, yet they rarely appear on our main national environmental groups' agendas. The new environmentalism should also debunk consumerism and commercialism and the lifestyles they offer. Turn away from growth mania and the profit-centered economics. Redefine what society should be striving to grow. Challenge corporate dominance and today's main corporate form and its goals. Embrace deep change in the control and ownership of productive assets, and push against the anthropocentric and contempocentric values that are currently so powerful in American culture. We environmentalists must also join with social progressives and others in addressing the crisis of low incomes and economic insecurity that are now unraveling America's social fabric. We should make common cause with those seeking to reform our politics and strengthen our democracy. And we should fight the vicious circle of income disparities, further shifting political access and influence to wealthy constituencies and large businesses. Environmentalists need to embrace public financing of elections. New anti-corruption ethical restrictions on legislatures, the right to vote, tougher regulation on lobbying and the revolving door, nonpartisan congressional redistricting, and other political reforms as core items for us. We must join campaigns like Move to Amend to forge a new constitution that recognizes that corporations are not people and money is not speech. Above all, the new environmental politics has got to be broadly inclusive, reaching out to embrace the concerns of working families and union members, people of color and minorities, frontline communities, family farmers, religious organizations, the women's movement, and other communities of complementary interest and shared fate, many of which we have too often ignored in the past. In my books, I've made the case for driving systemic changes so deeply that our country emerges with a new political economy. In a nutshell, here's what we should be seeking to build: a new system that routinely, almost automatically produces good results for people and planet, rather than a system that makes these objectives so difficult and sometimes impossible to achieve. Certainly, the idea of a new political economy is too big to swallow whole, right? And for that reason, system change can best be approached through a series of interacting, mutually reinforcing transitions, transformations that alter the current system's key motivational structures. As I mentioned some of these transitions now, please know that I appreciate their difficulty and distance. And yet, as I'll mention shortly, after I run down some of these transitions, much is already being done. Let's start with the market transition. The market becomes a secondary force in economic life. Cooperation and planning are dominant. Tight regulations ensure that prices are honest and wages are fair. The corporate transition. Profit becomes a secondary motivation for enterprises. Businesses are focused instead on producing social and environmental well-being. Economic democracy predominates, embracing worker ownership, co-op, community and public ownership, public-private hybrids, for-profit, not-for-profit hybrids. The growth transition. GDP, which some people think should be called grossly distorted picture, is recognized as a poor guide, and its status is ignored in favor of growing democratically determined priorities. The transition in investment and finance. Investment for high financial returns is largely replaced by investment for high social and environmental returns. Public and community banking predominate over private, and Main Street over Wall Street. The social transition. Vast social deprivation and economic inequality are both reversed by powerful social justice measures, ensuring fundamental fairness and genuine equal opportunity. Lifestyle and culture transition. The failing search to satisfy non-material needs with material possessions is replaced by new lifestyles beyond consumerism. Other people are recognized as the main source of happiness, not possessions. And nature is seen as a communion of subjects in which we are integral. The communities transition. Runaway enterprise and throwaway communities, that pattern is replaced by vital local communities that prize vigorous democracy and human solidarity. Racial and religious discrimination, rejection, and intolerance are replaced by finding joy in diversity. The democratic transition. Creeping corporatocracy and plutocracy are rolled back. Political reforms, some of which I listed a moment ago, bring true popular sovereignty and empowerment of marginalized groups. I believe that such transitions are essential to escape the current failing system. I know they're hard, and I know they can sound utopian, but somehow we've got to manage to build a new system that yields good results and is much better than the one that we've got. And the good news is that I look at each of these transitions in a book that I did, America the Possible, and drew from a lot of sources about the policy measures that are there, available for us, and to pursue each of these directions and others. And I must say that if I can mention my favorite political leader at this point, if you look at BernieSanders.com and go to issues on that site, you'll see one after another of proposals that he was fighting for in the campaign that are system change proposals and would advance a lot of the things that I've been talking about here today. And indeed, I've worked up just one of those if we want to explore it further tonight, and that's the corporate transformation. But even better than these the knowledge about policies, we're already seeing the proliferation of innovative models along many of the lines sketched here, particularly at the local level around our country. Sustainable communities, transition towns, solidarity economies, new regional and organic food systems, locally owned and managed renewable energy, own your own utility, community development and finance institutions, sharing and barter networks, local currencies, campaigns to take back your time and move your money out of Wall Street. These have been expanding around the country. We're also seeing the spread of innovative business models that prioritize community and environment over profit and growth, including social and public enterprises, for-benefit businesses, worker-owned and other co-ops, local credit unions, public banking, like the new ones that have recently been authorized in California for each community to set up its own community bank, as well as numerous campaigns for fair wages and worker rights and racial justice and pro-family policies. And we also see new community-oriented and earth-friendly lifestyles. I love the expression, own less, do more, and rent the rest. Taken together, these initiatives provide inspirational models of how things might work in a new political economy devoted to sustaining human and natural communities. And if you think Vermont is ahead in much of this, I think you'd be right. I think it is. So thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity. I look forward to the questions and discussion. Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you, Gus. So for folks that are participating, if you could type questions into the chat box. If you just run your cursor over the bottom of your screen, you should see where it says chat. Then you, on the lower right, you will see the chat screen, and you can type in a question and then just hit return, and I'll see it, and I'll read as many of those questions as we have time for this evening. We have one here already, Gus, from Jason. It says, was there a certain point in time when we, the human race, went astray, when earth-worshiping communities became the minority?
Well, I wish I knew more about cultural history. I recommend the great Thomas Berry, who's buried here in Vermont as a cultural historian who has, I'm sure that there were various points, turning points, when we opted out of hunter-gatherers and moved into agriculture. There's a lot written about that as a major shift that, I think my concerns date roughly from about 1980. So it's a lot more recent than going way back into history. I think we were, and really the fact that we didn't follow up as a nation on Franklin Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights. That was a huge loss, I think, because he wanted very badly to make things like healthcare a right. And if he had known more about the environment at the time, he would have made environment a right. And I think, so there have been several turning points in our recent history when we lost footing and took the wrong way. I also think, just to comment on it, we've lost so many great leaders to assassinations and other problems. I think it was in our neighboring state where Ed Muskie lost his grounds, his platform for running for president, and what a great president he would have been. So anyhow, I'll shut up rambling around here.
Okay. From Ellen, how do Vermont public banking regulations look? Are there public banks in Vermont now?
Well, I wish I knew more about that. I think there are public funds that for particular purposes, where for certain purposes loans can be accessed, and there's public backing. I suspect there are loan guarantees and things like that. Maybe somebody else knows more about this than I do. But it's been mentioned that the possibility of consolidating some of these funds into a public bank. But what apparently Vermont does not have is a public bank for its own money. I think I've still got that right. At least that was the case when we demonstrated in front of TD Bank in Montpelier a few years ago, because they are the depository facility for Vermont's funds and working funds. So it would be certainly a thought to move in that direction towards a public bank in Vermont and towards a bank that, one in which Vermont was depositing its resources.
Mm-hmm. So Barbara says, thank you, Gus. Is there one small thing that we each could do right now to help our transitions?
Well, I think, one thing I was really smitten by when I went back and looked at some of the very specific things that Bernie proposed during the campaign. And I think there's some of those things that we can identify out of this list that has championed and on which there's been a good bit of work done, and take those things and see how far we can pursue them in Vermont as Vermont initiatives. For example, one is one idea that he had was a requirement that corporations begin to set aside certain numbers of shares into a fund that would be designated for the benefit of the employees. It would be worker managed funds that the funds could be spent on any number of sort of public benefit initiatives. And in other words, so that the shareholders are not the only beneficiaries, but the workers are. And over time, it would increase the worker ownership, and it would facilitate funding of a lot of different types of initiatives.
Wolfgang Schneider says, supposedly the US was sustainable in the 70s and no longer is, with more and more climate refugees heading north. What should our policy vis-a-vis these migrants be?
He may be talking about me. I'm not sure. No, I think that, let me say that our family has just not long ago gotten out of some beachfront property in South Carolina. And there were several reasons, but one of them was seeing that sea level come up more and more and the storm surges. And I think there's going to be a lot of people migrating into our region. And my guess is that that we should be prepared, that we should welcome this, but we should also be sure that we are taxing enough from those who can afford it, so that we're able to pay for the services. And we also need to be sure that we're using Act 250 and other tools sufficiently to prevent our sort of overdevelopment, and particularly in certain areas which have high natural values and high recreational values.
Okay, Bob says, I wholeheartedly agree with everything you propose, assuming that all politics is local. Speaker Tip O'Neill, what can I do to slow or stop economic growth in my own Vermont town, South Hero, where new houses keep popping up, where every politician, irrespective of party, doesn't question this growth, let alone try to slow or halt it?
Well, in general, I think we need measures of growth that are very different from the ones that are commonly used today. So in our towns and in our state and in our country, we just add up all the economic activity and count it as good, and it's just not that way at all. We need to know the things that we do want to grow, and I think there are things, so like healthcare, for example, and try to grow those things, and there are now there's a whole new, relatively new field of community well-being indicators. So a place like South Hero or Stratford here, where I am, could maintain with some help a list of a set of indicators which would measure the community well-being and not just growth in simple economic activity terms. And that would make a huge difference, because we would know when we were growing the things that really mattered to people, and not just the local equivalents of GDP. The other thing I'd say is that the Gunn Institute at the University of Vermont has prepared and maintains what they are calling, I think they still call it, a genuine progress indicator. Mm-hmm. And this is a measure of state economic activity that that adds in some of the things that aren't in the normal accounts that are of great benefit, like care work, for example, and subtracts out some of the things that are really, like repairing pollution damage, which is, and other things, jails and things like this, that you don't want to encourage. And so it measures the things that are beneficial to people and environment. And that would be great if it went up, even though we really don't need to be pushing forward with a lot of GDP growth. There's so many ways to improve people's livelihoods and provide jobs without thinking that, without just sort of priming the aggregate pump of economic growth and hoping that it all sorts out. we've been doing that. We've had tremendous economic growth in the country if you go back several decades. And yet we find that, wages really haven't gone up. We have poverty, and inequality like we haven't had since the 20s, the 30s. And anyhow, it's just, growth doesn't work if by growth you mean just GDP expansion.
Fran asks, do you think the Nordic countries have been able to successfully implement the economic model that you think we should move towards? How do you think they are doing so far, and how can the US move in that direction?
Well, there's a great deal to be said in a positive way about the Nordic model, and to somewhat lesser degree, the Netherlands. I think there was a book called The Spirit Level that looked at measured inequality in each country of the advanced economies. The G20, the old OECD. They had a measure of inequality, income inequality, and then they had a measure of social well-being and social decay. And I have to tell you that the Nordic countries are up one end, clustered at one end of this graph, with very high well-being and very low inequality. The US is at the other extreme. Well, one point of the work was to show the strong correlation between inequality and overall well-being of people. And they did show that, but they also showed that the Nordics were the best and that the US was almost off the chart as the worst. So I think we have a lot to learn from the Nordics. I think, it's some of what I've described tonight has been just termed by somebody else as Sweden squared. And I think there's a lot to be said for their models. I wish I knew a lot better exactly what they have done, but I do know that they have much better unemployment programs. They have much better income sustaining programs that much lower differences in incomes, much lower poverty, and I think these social performance is a lot better, and I think I think they have spent a lot more time and energy on thinking about their economies in the sense of trying to mimic nature, and to see the internalization of waste streams and not just discarding things into the environment.
Heidi asks, here in Vermont, Governor Scott feels that many of our school finance problems will be solved through growth in attracting young families, etc. Do you agree?
Well, I think young families are great, and I think we ought to be working to, make this a wonderful place for young families. I think we need some more housing. We do need to continue to strengthen our schools, and I think as people realize what we've got here, I think we will attract if we continue to build. I don't know that the overall economic growth, at least of GDP, the GDP, crude GDP measure is what's needed. I don't doubt for a minute that there are sectors that could grow in the Vermont economy. We're kind of the king of co-ops. I think we have the most co-ops per capita or something like that of anywhere. We have a lot of industries which are hatched here. Cabot, Ben & Jerry's, Seventh Generation, and others that are, that are more attuned to real needs than your average company for sure. And the Vermont, business, sustainable business group is pretty progressive in a lot of ways. I mainly worry about the governor on the climate issue. I think his sort of adamant position on any kind of fees or taxes. We could easily be generating a lot of resources for the people of Vermont if we were, taxing emissions and things like that. So I do worry a lot about that range of his positions.
So this is actually for me, just as a follow-up, but do you think that some sort of carbon tax really is what we need to do to address our consumption of fossil fuels?
Well, I think there are different ways to do it. And I am open-minded, so to speak. I'm so tired of waiting on a major piece of legislation. We now have a start in Vermont, a start that could catch us up with our neighboring states in this Global Warming Solutions Act. But where that's really going to go, we don't know yet. I think you certainly could, there are proposals to tax fossil fuel uses, so establish a charge on fossil fuel use, and then there are things that can be done with that money. You could have a program where the fossil fuel use was being taxed and the money was being spent back into encouraging electric vehicles. So you get, so you could certainly impose a fee. You could cap it, fossil fuels coming into the Vermont economy and ratchet down that cap over time. And you could, or you could just regulate it. You could just regulate it. You could have goals for transition to electric vehicles, goals for transition to renewable energy, and enforce those goals. Some of the trading schemes people are scared people because they could see some of the traders getting interested in forming climate derivatives and getting us into a real mess. But I think nationally, we certainly need a huge national program. And I think, I think President Biden has a good start in what he's proposing.
David from out in Bend, Oregon, thanks you for presenting your beneficial ideas and spending time with us, and follows up with, do you think your and Bernie's ideas will percolate up to the top where real systemic changes in policy are needed to make these great ideas really happen?
Well, that is the $64 question, isn't it? We have to hope so, but some of the hopes that I'm sure Bernie had, and that some of the people in my world and myself had, and for being able to move in these directions took a pretty serious hit in the voting. People liked Biden, but they didn't like anything that sounded like there was going to be much of a big change in some of the areas that I've talked about, including some of Bernie's proposals, which were castigated as socialism and job costing and other things, which is, I think it's basically were smeared in some, and particularly in some of the local elections. So that wasn't happy. That was the downside of the upside campaign, upside victory. But it's a pretty big downside. and how that's going to play out over time. I don't envy the president. He's got the president-elect. The president will have his hands full undoing the damage that Trump has done. It's going to take a huge effort just to undo the things that this prior administration has done.
Yeah.
And then to go forward from that, to thread that needle so we get a strong climate start, which I think he seems very committed to doing. But that's going to be tricky. And then to go beyond that to some of the things that Bernie has been talking about, it would be yet a third step. And hopefully we'll get there. So I'm with Bernie and the Pope, generally speaking. And I want their influence to persist.
Let's see. Jason asks, how do we overcome the me first and more is better mentality? Seems like we need a big value readjustment, but how do we get attention on this?
Well, I've written a fair amount about this because I think Jason, is absolutely
Jason, yeah.
Right. We do need a value transformation, I polled a number of, communicated with a number of sociologists and others about what would it take to really wake up people to the need for a different lifestyle, a different set of values. And the one common answer I got was a crisis that makes people think and delegitimizes the way that we are thinking today too often. And I think the faith communities, the religious communities can have a big impact on leading I think the social movements can help because they dramatize failings and the need for a new way of approaching things. Leadership, leaders who actually embody what they're preaching in their behavior and stick with it and hammer it, can really make a difference. Social advertising, public interest advertising can make a social marketing, whatever you want to call it, can have a big impact on people's thinking. So if you, and of course, education, and not just formal education, but ongoing education. I mean, one area of a huge educational initiative that's very plain now, it seems to me, is understanding science. Not a particular piece of science, but the way the scientific community works, and the safeguards that are in that process, and the successes that have been made by the scientific method, and we have half the country that has very little faith in what we think of as good science, and really doesn't believe in, for example, evolution, or some huge portion of the country don't know how many, how long it takes the Earth to go around the sun. There's just this huge void in there, and so that's one area for a public education effort. It have to be done very carefully, with some subtlety, and it's so there are things that there was I think it was Moynihan, Senator Moynihan from New York, who once said the central conservative truth is that values and culture matter deeply. But the central liberal truth is that a society can consciously change its values and its culture. And I think that's, so there's a lot we can do. And the faith communities are very important in this potentially.
Got a real pragmatic question from Chris, who says, I was reading about no growth societies in college and it makes a lot of sense. But now that I'm retired, I rely on the growth of my investments for income. What would happen with retirement funds in a non-growth society?
Well, presumably you might not make as much money, but presumably if you're saving, you would be getting some return on your savings, and it's but you know, we need to half the people in the country soon are not going to have any savings when they retire. It's you know, the whole world of saving money for retirement is diminishing rapidly, and for a lot of people gone. So we're going to have to do other things, you know, broaden Social Security and have other programs. And if we had better public services, you know, for health, for you know, transportation, and other things, you know, we wouldn't be so dependent on our own personal resources. We would be dependent on social resources. And this is what has, you know, sustained very high tax rates, for example, in those Nordic countries that we were talking about, because they get such wonderful benefits from the public services programs. So anyhow, yeah, we're living on the income of investments, but I've been so spooked lately, I haven't been able to put much of it on the market, even though it's been going up.
So Thomas asks us, if these changes cause higher prices for necessities in the US, won't we have to impose tariffs to keep out more cheaply made goods from overseas, assuming that not all countries will buy into the new social economy?
Well, the sort of effect of how we situate this with regard to sort of the rest of the world is a complicated thing. But we certainly, if we are doing things properly, you know, like, and other countries aren't, let's assume that we're doing something properly on the climate issue, and it's running up some prices, and other things are running up prices, like incorporating all the external costs that are now being borne by the environment and by children and other things. So if we you know, if things become pricier for these reasons, then we need to have border fees of various types on incoming goods from countries and services from countries that aren't taking those steps. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've got quite a few more questions here, Gus. Do you have the time and energy to keep going for a while?
Sure.
All righty. Ellen asks, having spent 10 years in leadership in academia, what are some ways to change higher learning structures to prepare graduates, especially those heading to jobs in corporations, to change business models?
Well, I think that's a good question. Wow. You know, once you have the will to do it in a university setting, you know, it could be done. But universities are pretty conservative places, and so we could, you know, at my university, we had the wherewithal to introduce courses on all kinds of innovative subjects. And we've had that at the Vermont Law School as well. But it doesn't, you in the end, you also need to have faculty growth in these areas that are innovative and new and experimental. And it's just the fact is that not all deans and managers at universities and provosts are interested in making these changes. There's a sort of orthodoxy about what success amounts to in different disciplines that in some institutions is very hard to overcome. I didn't find that to be the case where I was at Yale for a decade. The limitation there was more of my own imagination and understanding of what the future requires. So I would be very interested in, for example, we are now working on what we call, next system studies. We're trying to encourage schools and universities to adopt programs to where there's an investigation of alternative systems of the type that I've been talking about, and then so wish us well.
Barb asks, actually, this is from George through Barb. Historically, humans have designed their social architectures to be hierarchical, with wealth and power concentrated in a handful of kings or plutocrats. Our current capitalist architecture is designed to create inequality. How does one revamp the architecture when we don't even have a shared truth about what is reality?
Well, I think that's a fair commentary. And you look at what's happened in the US and in the last decade, say, even huge growth in upper incomes and the sort of marginalization of huge numbers of people. I think 3 or 4 Americans have the wealth of over half of the rest of the country, well over half. It's hard to imagine more concentration, but there's nothing right now in place to stop it except what we might do at the federal level. So I think this is a huge problem. On the other hand, we know exactly how it happened. We know the tax changes, and not just the recent ones that Trump got through, but going back. We know a whole series of measures that in effect contributed to this return of the very, very high levels of inequality in the country. And so the policy proposals for moving towards very far more equal society are not hard to understand. They're just hard to do. And my thought long term is that we need to evolve towards a system of understanding of what a upper income maximum and a lower income minimum is. And for example, in universities, you have a scale in effect where at the bottom of the scale there's there's an income there, and at the top of the scale, but you can't go wild at either end. Usually you don't pay below minimum wage nor do you pay these salaries of many millions, except maybe to the football coach. And there are the military is another system where there's a top and a bottom, and there's incomes are bracketed in a way that is far more equitable. So we could I'd love to see that become more of the norm, and see that start in the individual corporations. Mm-hmm. So what Bernie was was going to upgrade, increase corporate taxes in corporations where the CEOs paid themselves exorbitant amounts of money, which I thought was kind of cool.
So Heather wonders, have you heard of the new group Climate Crisis Policy? They are trying to bring climate and environmental groups across the country to help develop new policy and legislation for 2021.
I know of a group called, the Climate Mobilization, which is trying to, I don't think that's the same group. The Climate Mobilization is trying to bring the spirit of the World War II mobilization to the climate issue, right? And the extraordinary things that were done in very short order at the outset of our participation in World War II. But I don't know that I know that group. There's been a number of new climate proposals. I think anything that tries to increase the viability of strong climate action in legislatively at both the state and the federal efforts are all to the good. I mean, the Sunrise Movement has proven that young people can have an effect, and they're pushing hard and they're determined. And we have a lawsuit. I'm participating in a lawsuit of 21 young people who sued the government 5 years ago to demand a climate plan, and we we still litigating to try to win that lawsuit.
Good for you. Just looking back at the discussion on Scandinavian countries, somebody wanted to mention a book that they thought was a good book by George Lakey, Nordic Economics, How the Scandinavians Did It and We Can Too.
Well, I'd like to see that. I actually haven't read that. That sounds good.
One thing that I always hate to hear, that just, as an ecologist, I'm very much focused on land and habitat loss. And when I hear a reference to housing starts as an indicator of a healthy economy, I just imagine all that habitat being destroyed and fragmented. And I think, how can we possibly believe that housing starts as an indicator of a healthy economy?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of, there are housing needs in Vermont, serious housing needs, but they can be met in a way that with co-housing and cluster development, and we now have a pretty bad sprawl, as you say.
What are your feelings about the longer term threats of population growth worldwide?
Well, it's a tragedy what we have not been doing, so to speak. When I was in the UN, we had real hope that the approach that was coming together, for example, at the Cairo Population Conference, was really going to make a huge difference. And that approach, is maternal and child health care, advancement of women, job opportunities for women, education for girls. And you put that package together, and fertility rates do go down, and go down substantially. And it's not coercive. And non-coercive family planning services with those other things, and it really works, because we've seen it work. But we didn't fund that Cairo plan of action. The world didn't. Less than half, I think, of the committed money actually materialized, and the programs didn't grow to the strength that we needed them. We were hopeful back then, and it wasn't that long ago, that world population would level off at 8 billion or less. And now it doesn't look like we're going to do anything close to that. And so, we've added billions of people to the projections. And it's going to cost. It's going to cost us. The world will pay a price for accommodating all these folks. Having said that, tendency to put the blame on the places that have had the highest fertility rates overlooks the fact that on a per capita basis, the rich folks are the real culprits here.
Yeah.
At least in the current time frame where it really matters. For example, on climate and all. I mean, we are, the rich folks are the problem. And, one day we'll all be problems, but it's not just the rich folks. The middle income contribution is now very large too, to the, planetary burden, but it's not the poverty that's the problem, it's wealth that's the problem.
So this circles back to something you were talking about earlier. It's just a little more specific, I guess. Do you have any advice on how groups such as local planning commissions can address this growth proactively?
Well, no. I mean, I do not want to pretend to know a lot about that. We know we need to, I think what we've tried to do in our little town is to cluster growth, to push things into our communities and not have them spread out over the landscape. The fact is that we have, I don't know about other places. There are places like over on our side of the state, like White River, where there's a lot of growth going on, a lot of new construction, housing, retirement facilities, and other things, and I'm no judge of how well it's being managed. In our little town, we have very little growth pressure.
Well, I think that we've touched on almost everybody's questions here, Gus, and I want to thank you for spending time with us tonight. I really appreciate, once again, your willingness to speak for us and speak to us. For those local people in the Salisbury area, we have purchased some of Gus's books, and they're in the Salisbury Library, if you'd like to take them out there. And I'm sure you can find them on Amazon and at our local bookstores, at the bookshop in Middlebury, and the other small bookshops around the state as well. So thanks again, Gus. We will have a recording of this, and I'll let everybody know where it is. Good luck, and keep working, everybody.
Yeah, well, thank you all for tuning in, and thank you, Jim, for having me. I really appreciate it, and good luck to you.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.